A couple of weeks ago, I was in one of my classes and my professor asked us a question. I immediately knew the answer, so I slowly started to raise my hand, but before I could say anything, a guy in my class quickly called out his answer. He said it so confidently that my professor went ahead and wrote it on the board, even though I knew that there was something wrong with the last part of it. So I kept my hand up, and when she called on me, I said, well, actually, I think that there may be something wrong with the last part of it, but maybe, I don't know, I could be wrong. Have any of you ever done this? Do you ever feel like you have to add maybe or I don't know to the ends of things, even when you really do know, just so you don't come across as annoying or a know-it-all? Or on the flip side, do you ever feel like you have to speak in an assertive and confident voice, even when you don't really know what you're talking about? These are examples of different communication techniques that we use. Traditionally, men and women speak very differently, and this can cause problems for women in leadership because when they are less assertive, they're seen as inferior, but when they're more assertive, they're seen as abrasive. I think that learning about this topic is something that can benefit everybody here because it's important to be able to understand people's communication styles in order to really respect them. So today I want to tell you a little bit about why men and women speak so differently, how that manifests verbally and non-verbally, and how it's impacting women in leadership. And before we get into it, I do want to have a quick disclaimer that this is just what is commonly seen in men and women's communication styles. It does not mean that you have to speak a certain way because of your gender. It's simply a reflection on how society has taught us we should speak. So before we look at how men and women communicate differently, I want to show you a little bit about the reasons why we do. In the book, The Developmental Social Psychology of Gender, that was released in 2000, it addresses how social influence affects our communication styles from a very young age. Boys and girls start communicating differently as early as preschool. Boys are more likely to use language to try and compete with each other, to gain control, and to one-up each other, while girls are more likely to try and use language to form relationships and to understand each other. Boys are also more likely to try and change the subject of the conversation in order to take control, while girls are more likely to reinforce the already established theme to keep the conversation going. And these differences are encouraged throughout development and into adulthood. Society continues to enforce the idea that men should always be strong and dominant, while women should be quieter and focused on others rather than themselves. Because of this idea that society enforces, according to Karima Merchant's 2012 article, How Men and Women Differ, women and men tend to have entirely different purposes behind communication. Merchant says that women are expected to use communication to enhance social connections and relationships, while men are expected to use communication as a means to a tangible outcome, such as obtaining power or dominance. Men and women generally communicate so differently because they have pretty much opposite motivations behind communication that have been drilled into them since the beginning. So now to go into the ways that we see and hear these differences. The Developmental Social Psychology of Gender book goes into some of the ways that communication manifests non-verbally. Women tend to be more non-verbally warm than men. They lean in more and smile more. Men tend to display more visual dominance than women. A large component of this is maintaining eye contact. People who maintain more eye contact while they're speaking tend to be perceived as more powerful. And men do maintain more eye contact while they're speaking. While interestingly, women tend to maintain more eye contact while they're listening to others than men do. Part of the verbal differences between men and women's communication styles is what I talked about at the beginning of this speech. The idea of adding sort of, or maybe, or I may be wrong to the end of statements. These are examples of mitigated speech. Adding things like maybe or kind of is called hedging, and saying things like I'm no expert or I may be wrong is called disclaiming expertise. Women tend to use mitigated speech a lot more often than men do. According to Merchant's How Men and Women Differ article, women tend to use more expressive, tentative, and polite language than men do overall, but especially in situations of conflict. Women feel like they must be careful and polite with their language at all times, even when they're angry or they're trying to make a point. This can cause problems when women want to step into leadership. It seems like however women communicate, they can never be fully taken seriously as leaders. When they lean into a more feminine, other-oriented communication style and focus on empathy, they're seen as weak or distracted from the task at hand. And women interrupt less than men and are interrupted more than men, which can lead to their ideas going unheard. On the other hand, if they do communicate in an assertive way where they demand attention and say what they want, they aren't seen as powerful or in charge like most men would be in that situation. They're seen as pushy or bossy. According to Deborah L. Rhodes' 2017 book on women in leadership, male CEOs who speak up often in meetings are rated higher in competence than their female counterparts who do the exact same. And a study of performance reviews in the tech field found that negative comments about personality, such as being too abrasive, showed up only twice in 84 critical reviews received by men and showed up 71 times in the 94 critical reviews received by women. Also in Rhodes' book, she mentions that more research in the tech field found that 84% of women had gotten feedback that they were too aggressive, 53% of women got feedback that they were too quiet, and 44% of women received feedback that they were both too aggressive and too quiet. Like, no matter how women in leadership positions communicated, it wasn't good enough. So now you know why men and women differ in communication styles, how they differ, and how these differences are hurting women in leadership. It seems like no matter what we do, women can never communicate in a way that is acceptable to society. If we lean into feminine instincts, if we're empathetic and we smile more and we try to form relationships and conversation, we're weak and emotional and incompetent. If we turn away from traditional female communication styles, if we're assertive and dominant and say and do what we want, we're abrasive and bossy and another B word that I'm sure you can all guess. So for now, we continue to sit in the back of the class, knowing the answers, just not knowing how to say them in a way that will get others to listen.